Are we on? We're on. Okay. Welcome. Thank you very much. This will be the last lecture of this cruise. And it's a little different from the others because we're only going to talk about 80 years ago instead of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Anyway, this is the recap of my background, which we covered in the early presentations, just so you know that I didn't come in off the street. But let's discuss World War II, but in the Battle of the Atlantic, which really involves the British Royal Navy very, very strongly. In fact, Churchill labeled this the fight between the British Royal Navy surface fleet and Karl Dönnitz's U-boats as the Battle of the Atlantic. That's how we got that title and name, and called it the dominating factor throughout the whole war. It lasted the full 6 years, from the beginning of the war in September of '39 to the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945. 3,500 Allied merchant ships and 200 warships were sunk. Over 800 U-boats were sunk throughout this period. And unfortunately, about 60,000 seamen on both sides died, perished, which is more than all of the other deaths in conflict since the Roman era over 2,000 years ago. So it was quite a devastating battle, to say the least. Now, when the war started, Britain launched a blockade of Germany the day after the declaration of war in September 1939. And given Germany's limited coastline into the North Sea, as you can see by the red line there, this would have been very effective. It was supposed to be a major impediment for Germany. But of course, it didn't last very long. And of course, Britain itself, as an island, was highly dependent on importing goods from its trading partners, including the United States and, of course, the Commonwealth nations. And the most important one in some ways was Canada for them. Canada and the U.S. would contribute more than 1 million tons per week to Britain during this period. And it was clear that the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, would attempt to, starve Britain to death, at least, by stemming the flow of this merchant marine supplies. And the gray area, if you wish, is the main shipping areas from Britain to and from the United States. So it's like, it's quite clear this was a very vital road line, if you wish, supply line for England. We all know the story of the successful and heroic rescue of fishing boats of the British troops at Dunkirk. They were stranded on Dunkirk in 1940 when the Germans were invading not only France, but the Low Countries, Belgium and Holland. And this defeat by England and defeat of the Western powers led Germany to start considering even more greater efforts. In particular, Hitler said, whoa, we should probably next invade England. And so he and the general staff, the German general staff, started preparing plans to invade England. They would have, of course, be able to launch their invasion from Rotterdam and Calais. Rotterdam in Holland, Calais in France, since they had conquered those in 1940. They had invaded and conquered them. And it was going to be an amphibious assault, and they'd go to Kent and Sussex. So you can see Kent and Sussex, basically, is where they were anticipating landing, and they anticipated they'd be very successful. This was called Operation Sea Lion. And it was to take place during this whole Battle of Britain, the bombing of Britain, the Blitz, etc., that we probably are familiar with. And so 9 months after the start of the Second World War, that's what the plans were. Hitler and the general staff had plans. and following the Battle of France and that country's capitulation. Hitler hoped that he could just convince Britain not to fight, that they would capitulate, because France capitulated pretty fast. And he was thinking, aha, the Western powers, they're not as strong as we are. They're pretty weak. They'll capitulate. So he considered the invasion to be a last resort. And he said he'd use it only if all other things had failed. Now, as preparation for the invasion of Britain, he demanded both air and naval superiority over the English Channel. That's what he needed from his Navy and the Luftwaffe. And he looked at the proposed landing sites, etc. The German forces achieved none of this during the war. Further, and his military leaders held serious doubts about some of the prospect for success on this. But once they had decided to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, their army and air force were very much occupied by that. And so as a result, he postponed the British invasion. And even though Britain was bombed extensively, as we all know, the Blitz, this actual invasion of Germany never happened. He never was able to get it together. And so it's interesting, if you go back to our history of England, and we've done a lot of discussion about that, we discussed first the Celts invaded the islands of England successfully. Then the Romans invaded, and we talked about that. Then the Anglo-Saxons invaded after the Romans had left in 410 AD. And finally, the most successful invasion of all in 1066, the Norman French, who conquered really the whole of Great Britain and the rest. There was a lot of others that wanted to invade. The Spanish Armada was hopeful to destroy Britain's power, or England's power at that time, but they failed. Sir Francis Drake and the weather did them in. Napoleon wanted to invade, but he lost the power of his fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, so he was unable to invade. And of course, now we see that Hitler lost the opportunity to do the same. So 1066 is the last full invasion of England by the Norman French. Now, let's look at the war's geography. This is quite straightforward. The dark purple are the German Axis nations, Germany and Italy. The lighter pink is the conquests of the Axis powers. They really obviously got all of Europe and even a little bit of Asia, so to speak. And it's quite they were quite successful, say the least. The tan are the neutral countries. They weren't involved in the war. And the white are the allies. And at this point, it's Great Britain and the Soviet Union and what was left of French colonies in Africa. You can see the blue lines are the limited German coastline escapes. This is the way the Germans would be able to get into the Atlantic Ocean from the North Sea to launch their vehicles. And until the Germans conquered France and the Low Countries, the Netherlands and Belgium, they didn't really have real good access to the Atlantic Ocean, to say the least, for our Battle of the Atlantic. Let's talk about Germany. Karl Dönitz was a captain in 1935 when he was appointed commander of the submarine force of Germany. He believed that subs were the way to assure German naval success. U-boats had actually been very close to winning World War I for the Central Powers, for Germany, Austria, etc. That was really, Hitler and them said, yeah, let's use these. That's very important. By this time, the subs were faster. They could dive quicker in about 30 seconds, and they were tougher ships nowadays, if you wish. And more importantly, they had very good radio communication with headquarters. And that permitted Dönitz to come up with a procedure that he wouldn't have been able to do in World War I, and that's a wolf pack strategy is what they called it. Subs attacking in packs. And Dönitz calculated that 300 of Germany's latest U-boats would be all that they would need to knock Britain out of the war. And we'll see what comes of that. Once the U-boats could escape the British blockade because they had, conquered France, they could also then, they figured, starve, not only defeat Britain, but starve it into submission. And by 1939, Dönitz had convinced Hitler to order a buildup of the U-boats. The clincher, the thing that really sold Hitler, was the successful attack by U-boat 47 in October of 1939, 1 month after the war was declared. It crept into the British home fleet port of Scapa Flow, and we were up in the areas when we were at the Orkneys, and it sunk the 50,000 ton battleship of England, the Royal Oak. That convinced Hitler, these U-boats will be a very effective tool in World War II. So, once France was defeated, Germany created submarine bases in 3 places, at Brest, Lorient, and La Rochelle, which allowed the U-boats to attack convoys way further west in the Atlantic Ocean and spend much more time on patrol. These were docked, the U-boats were docked in fortified U-boat pens at those 3 places. And these pens, unfortunately, were impervious to Allied bombing in the beginning of the war. The bombs we had could not break through the really strong fortified concrete. And it wasn't until mid-1944 that the Allies had developed a new kind of bomb that would penetrate that concrete and as a result, make the pens not operable anymore for the German Navy. Until then, though, the U-boats had immediate success in sinking British merchant ships, and the future, in a sense, looked very, very bleak for Britain. They were already, destroying a lot of the supply lines to Britain. It was going to be a very difficult time for Britain to keep itself viable. Now, the one hindsight note that we should talk about is that Germany's resources were actually stretched very, very thin during the war. And Dönitz was never able to get the funding for all the boats he wanted or he thought he needed. It might have been a very different picture if he had been able to do that. So let's take a look at this. We captured a secret Nazi dossier that indicated they were targeting areas in the northeast of England as part of their 1940 invasion plans. And we just came from the northeast of England. That's Newcastle. As a usually productive center of industry, because Newcastle, your tour guides probably talked to you about that, a great shipbuilding place and the rest, the region was integral to the supply of the ships and the armaments for the war effort. This was one of the photos in that dossier, and it is of a cargo ship passing under the Tyne Bridge in Newcastle on Tyne. And so we were really in the heart of a place that was bombed extensively by the Germans, the Luftwaffe, during the war. It was hard hit, especially during 1941, and there was death and destruction in all the surrounding areas. You know, as April 41 drew to a close, there was a series of high explosive bombs, showers of incendiaries, and a parachute mine dropped from the darkened skies by the Luftwaffe. Now, the bombs were intended for the industrial targets, but they often went astray, and we've lost a lot of civilians. Britain lost a lot of civilians, and they killed at least 141 people, injured at least 600 more. These are civilians, not workers in the factories or soldiers. Now, this picture shows a devastated Guildford Place in Heaton, which is in Newcastle, and it followed a deadly raid on April 25. And this is the area today. It was able to rebuild 80 years after the Nazi attack. So, you know, they have replaced and repaired so much of that damage that we, on our tours of the town to get to Hadrian's Wall and all the other places, didn't see the destruction from the war. Southampton wasn't spared either, as you can well imagine. The above left photo shows the bombed warehouses in the inner docks of the city in 1940, and they were bombed like mad. Fortunately, the whole area now has been rebuilt and boasts a real state-of-the-art shipping warehouse and port facilities. And you know, you can take a look at some of these photos and see that they've replaced it. And when we were in Southampton, you could see that it was a very effective port, say the least. Now, I want to give thanks, if you wish, to the merchant navy. During World War II, 1/3, and get this statistic, 1/3 of the world's merchant shipping was British. It's because of their large empire, India, Australia, New Zealand. They had 1/3 of the world's merchant shipping. Unfortunately, between 39 and 45, 2,400 British ships were sunk, and more than 30,000 merchant marines lost their lives trying to bring supplies back and forth between England and its colonies or elsewhere. So Britain looked back in history to try to see, what can we do about this? What can we do? And there was one successful tactic that the Dutch had used, and ironically, they used it against British pirates, particularly Sir Francis Drake. And that was to do convoys. Before 1639, naval confrontations were highly chaotic. They would be individual vessels firing on one another from guns that were mounted in the bow of the ship. The Dutch decided they'd put all their vessels in one line of a battle arrangement, and then they could use the cannonades broadside they would have. And this became known as the battle line, or this is where we get the word battleships. It comes from the convoys that the Dutch invented back in that era. Eventually, the British adopted this convoy system, which allowed the Royal Navy to concentrate on escorting the merchant ships. The naval ships of the British Royal Navy would escort the merchant ships. They'd protect 30 to 70 unarmed merchant ships as they would travel to get supplies. The aircraft of the British aircraft also served as an umbrella to sort of protect the ships below. And this was a really strong example that they were able to follow. It's funny, the Spanish treasure fleets, which I think on this tour we didn't cross the Atlantic, so I didn't talk about them. The Spanish treasure fleets, which used to, the Spanish explorers, discovered silver and gold, etc., and they had treasure fleets going back to Spain, and they went in convoys to foil not only British pirates, but Dutch pirates at the time in the 15th and 17th centuries. And so they were very successful. So convoys were really a very good tactic. But, you know, you never know how bad it's going to be. This is the main routes between the U.S., Canada, and England. The Royal Navy initially protected these merchant ships sailing to and from North America. And they would go up to the point that they ended up would be in the top in Oban, Scotland. And the reason they went to Oban, Scotland was because that was so far away the Luftwaffe could not bomb it. They didn't have enough fuel to get to Oban, Scotland. It was out of the range of Luftwaffe attacks. Now, the direct route is the yellow route, but then you could probably still get caught by some of the German subs, the U-boats. The blue are the indirect route, but it's a safer route because it's further out. And that would be the way that most of these ships and convoys went. Now, Dönitz's wolf pack strategy had the U-boats now spread out in a long line, because they could get the information about the projected course of some of these convoys, and they could attack en masse, and they could overwhelm the escorts, the British Navy boats. And while the escorts would chase individual U-boats, the rest of the wolf pack could come in and sink the merchant ships with impunity. And this strategy required, though, a very extensive radio communication between the subs and headquarters to coordinate their attacks. And the Germans thought they had the total answer to that. They thought their communications were very safe because they encrypted their radio messages using this machine, the Enigma machine, which was considered unbreakable. And they had rotors that would change every day. 3 rotors would change every day using a system of key sheets. British code breakers also thought it was unbreakable, that it could not be broken. And they were up against the wall. They didn't know what to do. But on May 9th, 1941, the British destroyer Bulldog captured and boarded U-boat 110. And recovered her cryptological material, including the keys to the sub's Enigma machine. They captured the boat so quickly that the crew of the U-boat was so quickly interred that they failed to communicate back to headquarters, their inability to destroy the Enigma machine. And so as a result, the headquarters in Germany didn't know that one of their machines was stolen, the keys were stolen, and that, you know, they might have a chance, the British might now have a chance of breaking the code. Bletchley Park was the home of British intelligence operations during the war. And its code breakers were able to use this newfound knowledge from the captured U-boat to help break the new keys as the German Navy changed them. And in October of 1942, they were able to salvage material from another U-boat. And that enabled Alan Turing, which is a name you should know from World War II. He went further, and he was able to break the new Nazi code. And this is a picture of Alan Turing. He was a renowned mathematician whose instrumental work on code breaking thoroughly broke the Enigma code used by both the Germans and the Japanese. They had picked it up as another ally, as another, in a sense, Axis power, but in a different war theater in the Pacific. The Enigma intercepts that we got and we were able to interpret allowed the British to plot the position of the U-boat patrols and route their convoys around them. And the merchant ships losses dropped by over 2/3 in July of 1941 and remained low for the whole rest of the war. So this Battle of Britain wasn't going the way Karl Dönitz thought it did. Britain also did come up with other improvements for anti-submarine warfare, such as improving early sonar. Because early sonar, which could easily be fooled by thermoclines, eddies, or even schools of fish, could fool it. And it was only effective at very low speeds, because above 15 knots, the noise of the engine would drown out the echoes. And once U.S. was in the war, Britain shared this technology with the U.S., and so both research teams were at work to try to figure out a way to make sonar much stronger, much better, and they did, to say the least. Now, some of the tools that the Royal Navy had were these. These are depth charges. They're on the boat. They required the ship, though, to pass over the submarine so that it could roll the depth charges out from the stem or from chutes. These are chutes, I think. And they had to lay a pattern, and they would try to lay a pattern like an elongated diamond, and hopefully with the sub in the middle of that pattern. The charge had to explode within 20 feet to be effective, however. So this was a risky proposition and very good, piloting by the British ships. The Hedgehog, however, was something much easier and much better. This was a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon that could lob up. You could fire up to 24 mortars ahead of the ship as the British Navy ship was moving. And with contact fuses on it, all it needed to do, it would explode whenever they hit a hard surface, whatever that surface was. Now, the Hedgehogs had a kill ratio of 6-to-1, while unfortunately the depth charges only had a kill ratio of 60-to-1. So Hedgehogs became really vital in the anti-submarine warfare. In May of 1941, Hitler was able to launch a new German battleship. This is the battleship Bismarck. And the cruiser Prince Eugen began to sail with it, and they set sail to attack convoys. Now, it's really amazing. Bismarck was the largest battleship ever produced then, and the most sophisticated. We had nothing, the British Navy and the Americans had nothing at that point to compare with it. The British fleet was able to intercept the battleship off of Ireland, as you can see from the map. Unfortunately, in the process, the British battle cruiser HMS Hood was blown up and sunk by the Bismarck, because Bismarck had a much greater range of artillery. It could go much further than the Hood Hood's artillery could. But luckily, the Bismarck itself was slightly damaged in that battle, and it raced to return to France, as you can see from the red line there. And as a result, it never made it. It was disabled by an airstrike, and it was finally sunk by the Royal Navy. And so the best ship that they had was gone. And let me go back for a second. I mean, Hitler, this was a very heavy loss for Germany. And Hitler convinced himself that it wasn't a very valuable idea to use battleships or warships of any sort to raid the convoys. The U-boats would be the only way they could do it, but as you can tell, since the Enigma machine was broken, the codes were broken, they weren't being as successful at this time. Now the red lines, I'm sorry, this map is probably a little confusing. The red lines on the map show the extensive routes of all the convoys. And with the Battle of the Atlantic being the longest battle of the war, World War II, running, as I said, from the start of the war in 1939 to the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, Dönitz was frustrated that the priority for steel and equipment was not being given to him, it was being given to the Army and the Luftwaffe. instead of making more U-boats. He really never had, and I was amazed at this number, he really never had more than 14 ships in the Atlantic at any one time. And by May of 1943, Dönitz called off the North Atlantic Wolf Pack, saying, and this direct quote, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." Let's see why. Dönitz's aim was to sink Allied shipping faster than they could be replaced. But as the sinking by the U-boats fell, and the U.S. production of new ships rose, this task really became impossible for Dönitz. On this chart, the black dots show the tonnage of ships sank by U-boats before Germany started using the secret coding. The red dots show the Enigma code's success. This is before the code was broken by the Allies. U-boats were able to sink a much greater number of ships. The blue dots show once the Enigma code was broken and there was better radar technology, better sonar and the rest, the number of sinkings by the U-boats declined dramatically, as you can tell. And after D-Day, when Germany lost its bases in France, the U-boats had to make longer trips. There were very much fewer of them in the Atlantic to attack convoys. There were less sorties. And so as a result, the die was cast, and Dönitz was totally correct. They had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Now, this convergence of technological advances and increased U.S. production of warships ended the risk of loss by U-boats. And the blue dots in this chart show the dramatic increase in U-boats sunk after the Enigma code was broken. Of the 40,000 U-boat sailors, 30,000 never returned. Not a job I would have volunteered for, that's for sure. A very risky job. And the U-boats, while they sounded great success, this is some of them destroyed. When the U.S. entered the war and increased the number of warships, the German U-boats that had been the hunters became the hunted. And this map charts the huge number of U-boats that were lost, mainly in the Atlantic. And there's really even more than this. So here we have a better chart. The battle became a war of tonnage after the Allied resources won the day. U-boats could sink, U-boats sank over 6,000 ships, totaling about 21 million tons. But the Allies built over 38 million new tons in 2,710 Liberty ships. So as a result, they vastly exceeded the number of tons that the German U-boats were able to sink during World War II. Now, in 1941, the U.S., even though nominally neutral still until December 7th, extended the Pan-American Security Zone to as far as Iceland. And the U.S. presence in Iceland discouraged Germany from attacking Iceland, because that would have been a real negative if they had control up there, too. So with the exception of the Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, in the Pacific Ocean, the Battle of the Atlantic was the only battle to touch the American shores. Because U-boats did enter, as you can see from here, the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. For the U.S., the U-boats stayed not outside the 3-mile limits, but they stayed outside waiting for ships, merchant ships or warships, to leave U.S. ports before they would reveal themselves or expose themselves by attacking. And they were very effective, to say the least, until we were able to break the codes and we knew where they were situated. This is a wonderful little map or chart. It's brought to you by the American Optometry Society. And please memorize it for the exam, okay? Make sure you examine it. Can you imagine how difficult it was for a seaman to see a ship on the distant horizon and try to decide whether it was friend or foe? I mean, I don't know about you, but they all look the same to me. And as a result, they were supposed to determine that. It was vital that they tried to memorize the shapes of the ships, the profile, so they could determine whether friend or foe, and that was important for their own survival. But it's battleships and the rest look pretty similar with the turrets and the stacks, etc. Anyway, public focus is usually on U-boat successes. The aces, the scores, the convoys attacked, the ships sunk. But this camouflages the U-boat strategy failures. The enlarged barcode on the left shows the rapid increase of U-boat losses in orange, and versus the Allied ship losses in green as the war progressed. And you can see when we did face some really bad times, but overall it didn't, it wasn't a total failure. And this is a number that is sometimes hard to understand and believe because the war effort doesn't talk about it in this way. 99% of all the ships sailing were able to travel successfully. This does not lessen the terrible loss of the life and supplies that the U-boats did cause, but at no time were the supply lines to Britain fully interrupted. Only 10% of the convoys were attacked, and only about 10% of those ships were lost. And most of the ships were not in the convoys. The ships sank by the U-boats were loners that had been separated from the convoys, and that's how they were able to sink them, etc. So, England faced a dire problem because they were depending on 1 million tons a week, and they were not getting 1 million tons per week. The U-boat blockade did severely reduce Britain's home front provisions, to say the least. The attack on merchant ships from bases in France were very successful in the beginning, and they blocked supplies from reaching Britain. And here you can see, this is a butcher shop, and it's selling horse flesh because it doesn't have the cattle, the sheep, the pigs, etc. But even this picture doesn't show that it was the worst possible, because we all consider how bad could it have been. And does anyone have an idea why this picture shows that it wasn't the worst possible? Pets. The pets. Absolutely right. Four of the patrons of this shop had their pet dogs with them. Animals in the zoo were a candidate for killing and eating, but they were able to keep their pet dogs. So it wasn't quite as bad as we all envision. Certain animals, had to be used as protein, but pets were able to survive, and that's a good catch when you look at the picture. The other thing that you probably know, D-Day, the name given to the American and British coordinated invasion of occupied Europe in 1944, the defeat of the U-boats was vital to allow the Allies to build up the supplies and the troops for that invasion, for that breakthrough invasion. These Allied forces needed overwhelming strength in men and aircraft to surmount Hitler's Atlantic Wall, which was being manned by Erwin Rommel at the time. And without this vast amount of troops, aircraft, and supplies, D-Day could not have succeeded, but succeed it did as a result of the U-boat failures. And as you can see from the map, once the Allies invaded and landed on the beaches of Normandy, they were able to move into and across the continent very fast and finally liberate occupied France, occupied Europe. They eventually pushed the Axis power out of the war, the tide had turned toward the Allied victory that we are all familiar with, to say the least. And the Battle of the Atlantic, as I said, lasted the full 6 years. As Churchill said, it was the most fundamental battle, most important battle. The war finally did end in 1945. There are a lot of older movies, which I do recommend for you, that provide very good insights, especially into life on U-boats at the time. I recommend Das Boot. Das Boot is a German film, but it is really an effective look at life on a U-boat, which was not very attractive, to say the least. You didn't have a cabin like we have on this ship, that's for sure. And of course, there were many U.S. propaganda films that exclaimed the courage of the Allies in the battle against those U-boats. And The Enemy Below is just one such film. And you can see Robert Mitchum, Kurt Jurgens, I mean, good major actors, etc. So, those are great films. And if you have a chance, you should see some of them, because they really will tell you a lot about what happened during this period of time. And with that, I want to thank you. It has been, let me tell you, a real pleasure meeting all of you, as many as I could, and hopefully providing some interesting and entertaining background about our destinations on the amazing Silver Sea cruise. Lynn and I hope to see you all very soon on a future cruise. And with that, of course, if you still haven't looked at my book, take a glance at it. It's a travel memoir, and it's in the shop. There's a few copies in the shop, and I'll sign them for you if you buy them, or otherwise you could get it on Amazon. But with that, I really do thank you all and appreciate your attendance. Thank you.